Hey everyone, today we're looking at the Firefly 8SE, which is an updated version of one of my favorite action cameras. This new version has pretty much the same internal specification, including real 4K at 30 frames per second and stabilized 1080p 60. This new version also adds a touchscreen, and Firefly says they made some improvements over the original, so let's take a look at it, shall we? Included with the Firefly 8SE is a fairly standard action cam kit, with sticky mounts, right angle adapters, a couple of clips, but there is one thing that stands out compared to other action cams in this price point. The 8SE includes a USB microphone. That might be useful to improve audio quality when doing vlogs or other recordings. I'll show you the quality of that in a moment. The build quality of the accessories is pretty standard for an action cam. They're made out of plastic, and I honestly think that you should see which mounts you use the most and then invest your money into better quality versions of those. The camera itself is also pretty solid build quality. It's made out of a soft touch plastic and it feels pretty solid in the hands. There's a tripod screw on the bottom, 2 buttons on the side, a USB and mic input, and then the touchscreen on the back. The screen is bright and easy to see in the daylight. The touch sensitivity is pretty good as well. However, occasionally the camera would stop registering touches until the power was cycled. I'm sure that's something that can be fixed in a future firmware update. This camera's menu system reminds me of the SJCam SJ7 Star. Swipe left and right on the main screen to switch between photo and video modes, or press the settings button to open the settings menu. There are tons of resolution options, so you'll pretty much have anything your heart desires. Although it's worth noting, the only 2 options with stabilization are 1080p 60 and 1080p 30. There's also an option for auto low light mode, which prioritizes either shutter speed or brightness in dark situations. As well, there's a microphone volume setting, so if you're in the waterproof case, you can set the mic sensitivity higher. Now, let's move on to some video samples. Okay, so let's start off this review with a basic resolution test. This is to show you the difference between the resolutions the camera shoots, and then you can decide for yourself which is the best. This is 1080p 60, and I figure that this is the ideal resolution because it's higher frame rate and it has gyro stabilization. Let's move up to 2K now. This is 2.5K or 2560 by 1440, and this is also a very good resolution to shoot at because it has 60 frames per second mode. When you get up to 4K, it's only 30 frames per second, which means if you want to do slow motion, it's not going to be as smooth. But in 2K, you also do not have stabilization. Finally, this is 4K at 30 frames per second. This is the highest resolution that this camera shoots at, and it is also an excellent resolution to shoot at if you want all the detail that the camera is capable. I recommend for most people sticking to 1080p 60 or 2.5K 60 because both of those resolutions have a lot of detail and a higher frame rate. As I mentioned earlier, 4K does not have stabilization, and you'll really see the difference when I start to walk here. This is me holding the camera as still as I possibly can, and it is a little bit bouncy. Okay, and we're in 1080p 60 now with gyro stabilization enabled. It's true that there is a little bit less detail to the video, but it should be much smoother than the 4K mode in terms of the bouncing up and down, the bouncing side to side, that sort of thing. And finally, let's do one last comparison between 4K and 1080p 60. We'll start with 4K here. This is what the 4K looks like when we're staring almost directly into the sun. This is kind of a tough situation because there's dark shadows on the rocks and bright highlights, but the camera seems to be doing an adequate job of exposure, so let's switch over to 1080p and see the difference in detail. And now, this is 1080p at 60 frames per second. The first thing you might notice is that it's a little bit more zoomed in. You can see that we're missing the top of the pole there and a little bit of the beach compared to the 4K. That's to compensate for the gyro stabilization. In terms of audio quality, well, I've been doing something different with this camera, where I've actually been talking directly to the camera the entire time instead of doing a voiceover. That means that this entire video has been samples of the audio. I figure that this is one of the better sounding cameras that I've done to date, and it completely fixes my major complaint with the original Firefly 8S. Wherein the audio was a little bit muffled, this one is totally clear. That's a huge improvement and a major reason to recommend getting this camera over the 8S. So let's get in the car now and warp to downtown Christchurch and take a few more clips there. Maybe test out the external mic. Okay, so now we are here in downtown Christchurch to get a little bit more supporting footage and do some audio tests. This is what the microphone inside of the camera sounds like. In a moment, I'm going to switch over to the USB microphone that's included, just so you can hear the difference in audio. Alright, let's switch now. Alright, and here we are in the same situation, except this time we're using the USB microphone instead of the built-in microphone. The camera beeps to confirm that you've plugged in the USB microphone, but otherwise there's no indication on screen that you're using the USB microphone instead of the internal microphone. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the USB microphone will not work with a waterproof case, because of course it has to plug into the USB port on the camera. I'm currently using a gimbal in order to prevent shaking. Essentially, it is a mechanical device that corrects for any left to right, up and down movements. And in order to use that with the USB microphone, I had to turn the camera upside down. But the good news is that the Firefly 8SE does have an upside down mode, so it's really easy to do that and you don't have to fix anything in post-production. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is quite a tough situation for cameras like these to process. It is winter here, and that means that the sun is low on the horizon all day, and that means very strong shadows. Next up, let's go somewhere a little bit darker to test the low light. We'll just step into this mall area here. Action cams like this are definitely not made for low light. They're made for bright sun, or even in the forest a little bit, but low light like this is tough on them. Generally what happens in low light is they start to blur frames together in order to make 30 frames per second. The first thing to test with the action camera at night is how the stabilization does. So as I'm walking across the street, this is the stabilization in low light. This time we're filming night footage with the stabilization turned off. I'm doing my best to hold it steady. I'd also like to mention auto low light mode is turned off. The camera will not drop below 1/30th of a second shutter speed. That generally results in clearer footage at the expense of brightness. This is 4K 30 frames per second with auto low light mode turned on. And as you can see, the cars are not particularly sharp. They're more of a blur of headlights than anything else. And here's the same footage with auto low light mode turned off. So that means it's stuck to 1/30th of a second. Alright, so this time we're looking at 1080p 30 with auto low light turned on. As you can see, things have gotten just a little bit blurry, but they're a lot brighter. So basically, night footage is usable from this camera, but it's not great. It's a limitation of the camera's lens, its sensor size, the maximum ISO. All of those things add up to a camera that is not super good at night. However, that's the case with every single cheap action cam, and even some more expensive action cams, just because you're limited by the hardware. Of course, a camera like this is never going to be as good as a high-end cell phone for processing a scene like this with bright highlights and dark shadows, but it is pretty good for an action cam. So I'll show you the difference between my cell phone and the action cam here. You can see that the action cam is a much wider field of view, to say the least. But let's move out into the sun and you'll see the difference. It's also worth noting that the action cam is around $110 and the cell phone is around $800. So, this difference can be excused for that price. And this final audio sample is with the camera inside of its waterproof case. I'm showing you some still photos while I'm playing this sample, and I just wanted to note that the still photos from this camera are better than the Firefly 8S. They seem to be a little bit clearer, especially in dark situations. Although it's worth noting that it is quite tough to do a handheld still at night with this camera. In conclusion, I think the Firefly 8SE is the budget camera to beat. It has great video quality, real 12 megapixel stills, excellent audio quality, and lots of features. To me, it seems like the camera with the least trade-offs for the low price. The only thing that you're really missing from this is stabilization at 4K resolution, or 4K 60, but if you don't need either of those things, then definitely get this camera, and while you're at it, pick yourself up a gimbal too. Let me know in the comments what you think of this camera, and as always, thanks for watching.